It's great to come back to this building. I remember it when it was a construction site, designed by Zaha Hadid, of course, who was a great friend of the Design Museum. In fact, when we were fundraising to build the structure that you see behind you, well, to restore it, it's from the 1960s, but we had to raise money to rebuild it. Zaha actually bought our previous building, and for the last 2 years of her life, she was our landlady. Quite a privilege, really. It's great to also take part in a forum like this, which brings together artists, designers, curators, and museum directors. Sometimes there's a lack of opportunities for those groups of people to share a conversation. All of us bring a different perspective to these things. Sometimes I think that we design curators should be the most humble in this ecology. The danger is that as curators, we become like disc jockeys, talking too much over the music, when the real purpose is actually to understand what the work is. I was not hurt, but I understood exactly what the wonderful artist who preceded me was talking about when he said that, of course, people prefer not to go into a museum, and they certainly don't read any texts when they get inside, even though some of us spend all our lives trying to write this stuff. And of course, that also is, I think, one of the big differences, which really does make a barrier between art and design. Art speaks for itself. It's a primary experience. You don't need to read the label. You don't need for someone to tell you what this work is, for it to speak to you, to move you. I mean, a museum of design, for me, is something rather different. Design is about life. It requires you to know something about the person who made this object or this computer program, the people that used it, what it meant to them, what its significance was. And that means really using those objects to tell some kind of a story. And that's what we've been trying to do with the Design Museum, which is now in England. It's been 40 years since it started, 1983, 1982, which, of course, is a hugely long time ago, and yet almost yesterday. It's a time in which there was no internet. It's a time when there was still something called the Soviet Union, and Nokia, in 1982, I think, produced its very first mobile phone. It cost $4,000, and they gave one to President Gorbachev as a publicity stunt. And just think about how much the world has changed in those times, and how much faster that world of change, and how much it's speeded up, how much the world of what design discusses has transformed itself. In the 1980s, one could have had a perfectly reasonable museum of contemporary design almost entirely through a collection of very well-chosen chairs. You would start with the first mass-produced chair, the Tonnet Bentwood, and then you might move to the Bauhaus and tubular steel, and then maybe plywood from Alvar Aalto in Finland, and eventually you'd find the plastics. And that's, of course, a very direct way into design. As a museum director of design, one always has the public wanting to see the chairs. We have a very direct relationship with the chair. As Peter Smithson, the architect, once suggested, humans are attracted to the chair because they are symmetrical like human beings. They have arms and legs, and they have that sense of a relationship with us. And yet, of course, we know in the last 40 years how much design has become about so many other things. So the talk today is really speculating about how fast can we go, and where is design moving us next. Now, Buckminster Fuller, a great figure in the story of 20th century engineering and speculation. Here he is in his fantastic white trousers and his very smart blazer, next to one of his less successful creations, the Dymaxion car, which was streamlined. It had 3 wheels and unfortunately killed a pedestrian when it was unveiled at a World's Fair in Chicago in the 1930s. And beyond that is a rather more successful idea of his, the geodesic dome, the bug-eye shell dome, which was really about doing more with less. Now, Buckminster Fuller once remarked that if you want to predict the future the best way is to design it yourself. And in some ways, I think design always is about doing things which will change what happens next, but not necessarily always in ways in which people predict. So this was a speculative scheme which Fuller did, whether it was as a real proposal or as an awful warning of what the world might become. The man, of course, who invented the term spaceship Earth, he was talking about a future in which a city was such a complex organism that it needed to be treated as one entity, or possibly it was to protect it from the pollution that he thought was coming. And you can see the influence of that image in the work of a contemporary generation of architects. Norman Foster, who was, of course, a collaborator of Buckminster Fuller's. They worked together on designing a house that was never built, on designing a theatre in Oxford. And here, of course, this is not Buckminster Fuller's dome over Manhattan, and yet it is also, in some ways, an idea of an office complex for Apple, which is, in some ways, a complete self-contained world. So was Fuller predicting the future by designing it? And sometimes those predictions about the future can be rather less serious than Fuller's. Here is a speculation about the self-driving vehicle. We just love the ideas of the future from the late 50s, the early 60s, because in those days, of course, the future still seemed like something rather wonderful, rather optimistic, a world in which things were going to get better. And of course, we have a rather darker view of what the future is now. We're less sure that the future will be better than the past, than once we were. And of course, this did also come true in another way. It produced the Waymo, the Google car, a car designed to look as friendly as possible. It's got a big smiling front. It's got great big eyes. Looks like a kind of cute pet. And of course, it's going to change, not maybe necessarily this particular model, but it's going to change utterly the way that we navigate the city, our relationship with the car, our sense of its ownership. A self-driving car is going to cut that connection which even the most determined car enthusiast has with a car. If it drives itself, it's a very different emotional relationship. And you can see how some things which again begin as somehow optimistic might take on other connotations. So 3D printing was going to transform the world. It was going to make everybody capable of producing almost anything. And one of the less attractive aspects of it is the idea that you might be able to download open source plans to create yourself a gun at home. If there was one person who really has redesigned the world, it was Steve Jobs. And it seems almost impossible to think that this image is only 11 years old when he launched the first iPhone. $1 trillion company later, the world is utterly different, even in ways in which he did not predict, I suspect. And here he is teasing his audience, producing the first iPhone, which, as he put it, was going to be partly the music system that they were already doing, the iPod, but it could also make telephone calls, and it produced, of course, this, which initially seemed like rather a strange leap in the history of telephones. What had happened to the buttons, and why had it got so large? Until this moment, mobile phones were getting smaller and smaller. And suddenly, of course, this thing, which initially didn't create quite as much of a stir as it might have done, but without this, there will be no Uber, which has utterly transformed the way that we navigate cities, the way that economies work, for better or worse. There would be no shopping apps. Amazon has become another $1 trillion business. And the way that you can now consume without leaving home on your smartphone has utterly transformed the way that we live, the way our cities work, the way that we buy, the way that the economy works, in ways which even Jobs, I suspect, would not have suspected was going to happen. There would be no Airbnb. there will be no Tinder, which has changed the way that we meet each other, the way that we fall in love, or the way that we spend an evening. Again, without that phone, and even the word phone, of course, is an inappropriate term for it, the world will be utterly different. The world of the museum has been transformed. Our museum gets 600,000 people through the door physically, but our Twitter followers are now 4.5 million, people who will mostly never come to see the museum, but it makes us understand that, yes, museums do have a future because they are physical experiences, they are shared experiences where you do have a chance to switch off your screen and go and do something with other people, to experience a shared experience. And yet we also have to understand that this does not happen in isolation, that there is this digital world beyond the analog one of spaces. And so many of these things, as with the 3D printed gun, have both positive and negative outcomes. The world can now go and experience the Mona Lisa, but what kind of experience is this when people are queuing 7 deep for a chance to take a picture of it, and they start actually literally fighting each other to get closer to the picture so they can actually be in the picture with their wretched selfie stick? And we're transforming the way the museum operates. The Louvre, 20 years ago, commissioned IMPay to build a pyramid in the courtyard, which was going to transform the museum to be able to deal with 3 million visitors a year. They're now once more transforming that museum to deal with 10 million visitors a year. And what kind of experience is that? What kind of relationship can you have with art in those kind of circumstances? Or we saw social media for about 6 months as being this great democratic liberating force. This is the Egyptian revolution, when for a moment it seemed the world was going to change through this democratic, accessible form of communication. And of course now we have a political system shaped very differently by the same social media. We have an American president, for better or worse, who ran for office through the medium of Twitter. One has this social media in which you could see the return of the Middle Ages in some senses. Twitter can become, yes, a forum for the exchange of ideas freely, but it can also become a vicious and vindictive lynch mob tracking down people whose views they disapprove of. And this rate of change is not going to slow down. Despite Elon Musk's latest pronouncements, he is still in command of SpaceX, which is building private enterprise rockets, which he is certainly aiming to use to get himself to Mars. As he puts it, I want to die on Mars, but not necessarily on arrival. And you can see those Silicon Valley billionaires who made their fortunes out of the first generation of digital technology, out of YouTube, out of Google, out of PayPal, being invested in projects originated by this remarkable-looking figure, Aubrey de Grey. He's a Cambridge-educated geneticist and biologist who is funding research into programs which he claims will allow humans to live to be 1,000 years old. To judge by the look of him, I don't think Aubrey is going to make it himself, but some of the people behind him are certainly looking to do that. And what social consequences will that idea of a constantly aging population have? It's changed our attitudes to age already. This is the idea that a fashion brand like Celine would use an 80-year-old Joan Didion as the face of their brand is, of course, a remarkably open and welcoming gesture. But in a world in which the average age of a Silicon Valley employee is 29 and a half, what are they all going to do if their bosses live to be 1,000? And our ideas about privacy are also, I mean, the home was once a place which, certainly in the Western world, was a place in which you retreated to be yourself. We now have a situation in which the smartphone and digitally enabled locking systems allow Amazon to for complete strangers to gain access to your home, to leave something in it, and then to leave, closing the door behind them. And that's a gigantic shift in social attitudes. that the home and our ideas of what is private and what is not are being shifted so quickly. So for 40 years, the museum has been looking at design as a means really to understand the world around us. And one of the things that we've been doing for the last 10 years is each year to stage an exhibition which is called Designs of the Year. It's a very simple idea. Around the world, we have 50 or 60 experts who we invite to nominate 2 or 3 projects that have been completed in the year before. And we collect about 100 of them, assemble them in the museum as an exhibition. We have a jury, and every year we hand out an award to the design of the year. And year one, it was this project, MIT Media Lab, Nicholas Negroponte, with the industrial design done by Yves Behar, the One Laptop Per Child project. And I show this partly because of the abiding embarrassment the museum has, because this was the same year the iPhone was launched, and the iPhone was also nominated, but the jury thought this was a more socially worthwhile project. And for about a year, it seemed extraordinarily strong, because this was the idea that you would transform rural poverty and emerging economies by allowing a generation of kids to be entirely digitally literate by giving them all a laptop that cost less than $100. But within 18 months, the whole project had evaporated, but the iPhone has gone on from strength to strength. And the year after, this rather amazing image was the design of the year. Shepard Fairey, the American artist, took a photograph of Obama, transformed it, and gave it something of the manner of an idealistic 1930s paper poster. Very strange project, really, because, of course, the poster as a physical artifact is dead. The political campaign that Obama fought to become the first African-American president of the United States did not involve people going around Washington pasting up posters. What this was a metaphor for another means of communication, and one which became extraordinarily powerful in the digital world. And we all know how many variations there have been on this particular treatment, almost as much as the kind of Warhol look. In fact, the Design Museum in the summer had a show which looked at 10 years of politics through the means of graphic design. It was called From Hope to Nope, beginning with Obama and ending with the most recent president of the United States. And we also have to be aware that design is not simply a physical object. So the year after, the award went to the British government's website, which is not about how things look, it's about how things work. And of course, the government website is Britain's front door. It's where its citizens apply for a driving license, or a passport, or a birth certificate. It's where they understand how they should pay their taxes, and where their pensions come from, and how to fill in a will. And it needs to be easy, accessible, and navigable by everyone. And that's why it seemed like a very worthy winner of what design can be about. And then the year after, it was this project, again from Harvard. It was a medical research team that wanted to do away with animal testing. So they put this together, which is a digital analog of human organs. So you can actually use these to test new treatments without actually using human or animal subjects. Or last year, this project was the Better Shelter Project, funded by IKEA and the United Nations Relief Agency, 2 Swedish industrial designers, the Better Shelter Project, which was trying to make the plight of refugees somehow more dignified and less bleak than it has been. So we're in a world in which change is moving more and more quickly. I was at a conference last year at the launch of the Norman Foster Foundation, at which Nicholas Negroponte, the man behind the One Laptop Per Child project, followed on a presentation by a digital fabricator who was behind this image, which is the Zurich High School of Technology, looking at how you might actually use robotics to create a digital architectural environment. And Negroponte said, well, that's already old school. We're now moving towards the world of genetic and bioengineering. And in his words, within my lifetime, you will learn Spanish by taking a pill, which may or may not be true. So that's the past. And I want now to show you this year's version of this exhibition. It opened at the museum just a week ago, and it's really looking at some of the things that I think that are preoccupying designers at the moment. It's about energy saving. It's about trying to deal with a world which is drowning and sinking in plastic. It's trying to find new materials of all kinds. It's trying to make design relevant, not simply as a tool to persuade consumers to buy more things that they don't necessarily need, but to really change the way that the world works. I think I'd also say that I think design and designers are now at a time in which they are more questioning than they've ever been. Design, to me, began at that moment when industrialization cut the connection between the craftsman, the maker, and the user, the consumer. The machine was able to make large quantities of objects cheaply and effectively, but they all had to be the same. They were generic products. So that connection between maker and user was cut. What came in its place was the designer. I mean, of course, there's always been mass production. There were coins, there were vases, ceramics, but it was a new thing in the 19th century when so many new categories of products were invented. And in that world, the designer's job was to make all these new products intelligible. If you've never seen a typewriter before or a sewing machine, you need to have some visual clues as to what it does and how to make it work. And the designer did that. And the designer also was there to persuade people to buy stuff. What makes an object desirable? Is it what it does, or how it looks, or how it feels? What makes one object more desirable than another? And that was kind of the role of what design was. If you think about the American designer Raymond Loewy from the 1930s, he was very proud of the fact that by changing the color of a Lucky Strike pack from green to white, he was doubling the sales. Now, that's not something that designers will boast about today, and we now live in a world, I think, in which designers very often see their role not to answer the questions of how do we make this product more cheaply and more desirable, but often really to ask a question about, should we make this product? Should we do these things? What are these things doing to us and doing to the planet? So here's a range of things which we have at the museum at the moment. So this is the Virgin Hyperloop. There was a test track of this made in the Arizona desert last year, and the project here is to use magnetic levitation through a vacuum tube to make vehicles capable of moving at 1,000 kilometers per hour, which was achieved in test conditions. Whether there will actually be one from Washington to Los Angeles, who knows? But if this does work, really the point is that it would actually become 3 times more energy efficient than a conventional high-speed train, and 6 times more energy efficient than air transport. Then we have the Mobike. This is a bicycle used throughout China by one of the most successful street bike rental businesses, reshaped by the very distinguished Japanese designer Naoto Fukasawa, who has made it unprecedentedly light, but also given it a new generation digital aspect so that these things can be tracked and returned to the most useful places within a city. This is a Swedish-made electric sports bike, off-road sports bike, 0 emissions, and also silent. This is Musk's Falcon Heavy project, which at the moment he's having a lot of trouble making enough Tesla cars cheaply enough. He's having a lot of trouble with his Twitter account. But the one thing that really is working well for him is this private enterprise space program. At the moment, this is the most powerful rocket on the planet, and this is what governments are going to use to get their payloads into space. It's also notoriously what he used to get a Tesla car into orbit in an interesting publicity stunt. But design is also about how a complete city can be made to work better. So this is a project from China. It's called the City Brain. It's devised by the man who's behind the cloud computing for Alibaba, and it's already in use in one smaller Chinese city. And what happens is that the city's traffic lights are digitally connected to cameras to an algorithm which tries to make traffic move faster. And at the moment, the research suggests that this is actually making traffic flow 10% more smoothly. And the long-term ambition would be to use this throughout an entire city with the target of allowing just 10% of the existing road surface to be used. So in short, if you're building a newer city with this kind of system built in, you need far less of the city's surface covered in tarmac and roads. This is a Taiwanese project called Trash Petso. It's a mobile unit which is used to go and collect plastic waste, to use the solar power collectors you can see on the side of it, to transform plastic waste into usable building materials, sheet plastic partitions or flooring. This is another project aimed at taking contemporary technologies out of the Western context and into places where there are less skilled users of it. So this is it's called the IC, and it's about scanning in non-urban situations people who need eye surgery. It's produced by 4 MIT students, and it's a very low-cost, affordable way of preparing patients for laser eye surgery. This is a similar project. It's called the Paper Fuge, and again, it's got medical applications. It was in a Ugandan clinic in a rural part of Uganda that the designer noticed that there was a very expensive, high-tech electronic centrifuge which is used for separating blood, which allows you to test for HIV or malaria, and it was being used as a doorstop because there was not enough power to make this thing work throughout the week. So it was simply abandoned, $500,000 worth of kit sitting there. So this got Tahinuma, who came up with this project, thinking about what is a really low-tech way to do that. How do you actually make a centrifuge that can actually cost almost nothing and yet can do the same job? So he took one of those children's toys, which is basically 2 whirling discs and a knotted piece of string in it, which actually also does that. And so this, for an object that can fit in the doctor's pocket, can do that same blood separation to allow blood samples to be tested for those diseases. This is also particularly ingenious. It's called the SurgiBot. Half the world is nowhere near a clean hospital. What happens to operations out there? Well, this is an attempt to actually solve that problem. It's an inflatable operating theater, which it's connected to a high-efficiency cleansing air filter, which gives you almost sterile conditions, and the operation takes place by applying it to the patient, and the doctors use those gloved apertures to gain access to the patient. This is more in terms of being a propaganda project. As we know, the world's oceans are drowning in plastic, and this is a project done by a Dutch, British, American group who've done as a kind of propaganda stunt the idea of creating an independent republic, the trash aisles. They've designed the passport, the stamp, and they've started a campaign for United Nations recognition for this entity, really with the aim of actually, not because it's a serious project to set up a country, but because they actually want to draw attention to just how drastic the issues of plastic in the Pacific really are. And this is on a similar theme. This is Plaza. It's a Dutch supermarket which, working with Made Thought and 2 other designers, have come up with the idea of an entirely plastic-free aisle in the supermarket. One of the key things was to actually persuade consumers that the stuff they were buying was appealing enough. And plastic's transparency is one of the things that actually has been in its favor. So they've used what looks like plastic but actually isn't, an organic material which can break down within 6 weeks of it actually being abandoned. This has now been installed and it's being rolled out throughout the supermarket chain. This is one of the examples I find most fascinating of designers really exploring other kinds of material with trying to use natural, organic materials to do without petrol and plastics and oil. This is a Japanese skiwear manufacturer which has been working with a group who've been exploring synthetic proteins. And this is a ski jacket made from a thread which is analogous to spider silk with the same kind of properties, but not using oil in any way. This is G-Star, who are again trying to make fashionable garments that do less damage to the planet. So it's organic cotton, which has been dyed using less chemicals, less fresh water used in its making. The patch is not plastic or leather, it's fabric. There's no zip, there's buttons, but it looks like any other pair of jeans. This is another propaganda project. There are at least 700,000 items of space debris out there, any one of which could at any moment knock out GPS systems on our mobile phones, and we have to start thinking about what that is. So this was a project commissioned by the European Space Agency for a conference where they tried to discuss some of the problems that all that space debris is doing. Of course, they produced something rather beautiful. This is another project looking at trying to transform our ideas about waste. It's done by a group called Forma Fantasma, Italian, but now based in the Netherlands. And they've taken IT scrap, bits of old computer. They've melted down the innards of mobile telephones for the gold and used them to create office equipment as a kind of rather banal, as a commentary on A, the banality of the office, and B, the craziness of throwing away so many precious materials. So they've made a waste bin, it's got gold leaf on the inside, the gold coming from these recycled chips from mobile phones. They've tried to create cabinets that use old keyboards for the structures of them. It's actually saying, look at this stuff. We can't just throw these mountains of stuff away or ship them off to Nigerian recycling dumps. And on the same lines, this is a final year project from the Eindhoven Academy. One student came up with this project called Lithoplast, and he's postulating a future in which the world has hit the buffers, our profligate use of resources has deprived us of so many materials that we had. So this plastic waste has now become something precious, almost like a fossil, which is mined. And his project was really to make a few objects out of this and present them in museum cases to say, look at this, think about what's happening next, where are we going? This is a much more practical project. It's designed by a Mexican architect working in the state of Chiapas. It's a very low-cost, easy-to-make space heater using ceramics. It avoids the use of charcoal. This is a French group called Studio Algae who have tried to create an organic material made from algae, which can be 3D printed to make objects which, again, don't use oils or plastics. These are two very different approaches to the water crisis. One is the Just Water project, which is backed by the actor Will Smith, and it's trying to make pure water in single-use plastic that can be recycled, working with Tetra Pak, which is a start. But on the other side is a project from a Dutch designer using terracotta to create a carafe. And to her, there's something crazy about us turning our back on the privilege of having absolutely pure drinkable water from the tap and buying water from bottles. And it's how do you actually overturn those attitudes? For 20 years in the West, the bottled water companies have been advertising their wares, and they've actually made a generation believe the only way to drink pure, healthy water is in a plastic bottle, which is, of course, nuts. So this is a very elegant, beautiful shape which actually celebrates the tap and tap water. It's a natural coolant. It just says this is something to actually do without all that plastic. This is another project which is not really, to me it's actually reminding us that design is still about beautiful things. This is a Israeli designer who works with salt crystals in the Dead Sea, creating these objects which have a very transient, fleeting existence, but for a moment they have this extraordinary, undefined and yet beautiful shape. And I think it's here that maybe design and art come closer and closer to each other, the moment when the utilitarian aspects of design vanish, and we're left with something which is beautiful to look at, amazing to touch, and maybe something that we also need in this digital world in which that smartphone that I showed earlier on has killed off so many of the objects which we use to measure our lives and define who we are and where our memories sit. I think this is from the Japanese designer Nendo. It's called the jellyfish vases, and it's extremely slender vases sitting in a large tank. Some of our selectors for the designs of the year value beauty above all, and Nendo is, I think, one of those very interesting designers who can actually cross that barrier. They can make practical things that work in large numbers. They can also make exquisite things that make every day just a little bit better and more appealing. This is another project using organic materials. Basically, this is trying to grow mushrooms to form building blocks that could, if they're shaped appropriately, create structurally strong enough members to support a roof. This was a demonstration project actually done, I think, for the Seoul Biennale last year by a team from Karlsruhe and the ETH in Zurich. This is where culture meets commerce. Lacoste, working with a project called Save Our Species, produced a set of polo shirts, which was a limited edition polo shirt, which is an interesting concept, which was sold to raise money for endangered species. And the nice thing was that the limited edition was limited to the number of species still surviving in the wild. So there is a porpoise of which there's only 26 left, so they made 26 shirts. And there was a dolphin, I think, which had 50, so 50 were made, and in total just 77,000 of these made. I mean, so it's, I think that we shouldn't always approach conservation and ecology with too serious and too severe a manner. There's time also for a bit of seduction and a bit of pleasure in this. This is trying to make what you might call vegan leather. It's genetically modified yeast grown to create a collagen which has leather-like characteristics. And this is Sony, 11 years after the original cyborg dog robot. They've just launched this artificial intelligence-enabled, much cuter pet dog, which will learn from the way its owner treats it. So if you beat it, presumably it will get fierce. And this is just a very simple way showing how design can be about observation. We're all getting older. We might need sticks to get around, so why not make a stick that's beautiful, light, it's printed, but also one which is easy to hold, and which, what do you do with your stick when you put it down? So this one, you turn it down, top to bottom, and the handle becomes a stand for it. I mean, just small, but such a nice observation. And I am with two digital projects. On the far side from me is a project devised in Mexico a couple of years ago by a team of journalists, coders, volunteer rescuers at the time of a traumatic earthquake in rural Mexico, at which government responses were poor at best. So volunteer groups set out to chart on maps where damage was, where resources were needed, where people were, what were the shortages, what could be done to actually help, who was needed to volunteer for this, to actually put people in touch with each other. And it worked so effectively that it was actually used again in the last Mexican elections to try to deal with fake news. And the other project is similarly about trying to make us more digitally literate. We began with the idea that social media was going to set us free, that it was going to be about liberation and democracy, and we've seen how it's become something which is controlled by some quite malevolent governments, some individualists who are very much about intolerance rather than tolerance. So on the right-hand side is Bad News. It's a Dutch-English collaboration, which is really a game about how fake news operates and the things that it can do for you and the things that you should actually guard against. So earlier on, we heard Bernardo suggesting that design has created a frightening world in which we ourselves, human beings, are redesigned, in which we are on the verge of being overtaken by artificial intelligence and machines. And yes, there are really serious bad things out there. And yet, when I walk through that exhibition of the designs of the year, I always come out feeling really optimistic, because these are things which actually show much energy and so much passion, and the sense that design can still make things better for us. Thank you.